Bitch by Jason Bradford. Chapter 20. A Witch and Her Treasure Chest. Tyler approached Elizabeth's house. The lights were all off, but the soft amber glow burned from the basement windows. The light was faint, but with his heightened sense, they danced before him, unable to be missed. He smelled the air. Something wasn't right. There was more than the smell of decaying flesh. The zombie ginger wasn't the only thing stirring in this dark part of the woods. Boris was silent, perched in a spruce not too far above Tyler, being vigilant. Tyler was careful, hesitant. He remained hidden in the shadows, cloaked in the thickness of the brush. What was that smell? It was different. The smell of something old, not human. He instinctively knew that what he was inhaling was not the scent of any mortal or human-made scent. It was something magic. He let the thick ferns and other brushes embrace him and keep him hidden until he knew how to proceed. Tracy still wasn't a consideration. Whatever the mystery was, Tyler knew he would be able to handle it and get his pack back to the clearing. Before morning, they would all be sitting on the wooden sofa, enjoying the final moments of nightfall before the sunlight broke the black sky and spilled day into the world. What time is it? Tyler wondered. He had to act soon. Wonderful. We have everything we need to find it, Elizabeth yelled. Finally, after all these hundreds of years of searching and pack slaughter to manipulate the werewolf population to just these fools. Elizabeth removed a razor blade from a workbench tucked just in the shadowed corner of the basement. With it, she also removed 4 petri dishes. She walked back to the cell and let herself in. Jack, Bill, and Karen were all awake. Elizabeth observed all of her prisoners, 2 werewolves and a human, restrained to the concrete walls with the strongest chains and shackles available. She felt a satisfaction wash through her, and she smiled. She stood, unmoving. She looked at the small glass brick window above her prisoners. The pitch-dark black that pressed against the window gave her a thrill. The night was hers, and she had been waiting for it for centuries. Elizabeth's smile grew as she waited for the midnight toll. Boris fluttered clumsily and erratically upon Tracy's sleeping face. Her head was frighteningly large, and the small vampire fruit bat feared he'd be lost forever if she inhaled. He might be caught in her vortex of air as it rushed into her enormous lungs. How would he find his way out of that? He backed away. He had to try and change back into a man. He couldn't wake her as the small creature he was. He turned away from her and grunted, pushing hard, trying to remember. He pooped. He looked down at the 3 small black pellets that he expelled in his attempts to become a man. He felt embarrassed for a moment, but continued to push. He was determined to become human again. Push, grunt, moan. Suddenly something happened. One of his wings became a human arm. His left wing flapped, and the long human arm tipped him over onto his right side. Another deep push and grunt. The arm returned to a bat wing, but 2 human feet appeared. The small fruit bat's body was carried in circles as his human feet tried to navigate their way upon the dried forest floor to... What am I looking for? Boris asked out loud. He looked down at his human feet, and he shrieked in fear and surprise. The reaction caused the new change. Both human feet became bat once more. And Boris was entirely a bat, as he had been for decades. It was no use, he thought. I know I'm looking for something. He looked up to the sky. It was oil thick and dark. He had forgotten what he was looking for. The forest was before him. Tracy was out of his sight, slumbering behind him, and therefore also out of his forgetful mind. Boris looked up at the stars that poked bright little holes in the black blanket that covered his part of the world. He felt a hunger pang, and the thought of a well-gorged mosquito or plump grub excited his palate. Boris flew up, high above the trees, realizing that the thing he couldn't recall must be the intention to hunt. With his speed flying on full force, in the blink of a human eye, he was gone and far from the clearing, in the opposite direction of Elizabeth's house. Midnight arrived, and the bite to Jack's finger from the severed head of David, the unlucky hiker, took effect, and Jack's form began the transformation. His eyes closed, and he became unresponsive, as his body shut down in preparation for the change. Elizabeth stood, ready, and adjusted his shackles, tightening them around his human wrists and ankles as he changed. Jack's bones cracked and snapped. The echoes of the splintering bones echoed against the concrete walls that surrounded them. His body became smooth, and the lighting in the basement offered a warm glow to his human flesh. He lay on his stomach, unmoving, as the last of the changes happened. Karen waited, and Bill watched for the change to not only be over, but for Jack to wake up. Karen was amazed that the bite of a dead man's severed head actually worked. She wondered how much investigating and preparation was actually invested. The thought of the commitment chilled her. At first, she considered a mother and her boy being this evil was a horrifying thought. Then reality hit her quickly. This wasn't a mother and son. They weren't even human. This was a hundreds of years old witch and her leech that called himself a genie. Who knew how old he was? Whatever the situation, Karen knew there had to be a way to stop them. She didn't come this far only to lose now to these two. A few moments passed and Jack stirred. He moved his head slightly as if trying to get comfortable. His eyes were still closed, and Karen knew that confusion and a foggy mind would be upon Jack for a few moments, like a hangover leaving the body. Jack spoke. "Love you." He whispered the words, unaware that he was speaking, or that he was human again. He spoke. Karen was shocked that he had found his voice. Karen recognized the words as a continuation of the sentence that he was trying to say in the den before he changed. She never thought she'd hear those words. He wasn't intended to ever be a human again, but still, hearing the words filled her with warmth and a resurgence of energy made of anger and determination that she would kill Elizabeth Good and her little monster, Dylan. Karen's eyes sparked a bright green at hearing Jack's voice. All she could do was think to herself, "I love you too." Now it was she who couldn't say the words. Before they slept soundly again, which they would both say the words and feel the power within them. But first, blood needed to spill. Elizabeth rushed over and rolled him onto his back, exposing Jack without modesty. The arrow had shifted during his transformation from lichen to human. It was now plunged into his large intestines rather than his heart, allowing him the ability to speak and move once again. This didn't seem to bother her. She sat him up against the wall beside Bill. His small human frame next to his werewolf brother looked silly, Elizabeth thought. She pulled the arrow from his gut, and blood trickled from the open wound, as well as a small pinch of intestine. But the wound healed quickly. She placed the tip of the arrow against Jack's chest and slowly slid it in until his heart was pierced once more. Jack was still, silent. Elizabeth lifted Jack's head, which hung low and rested on his chest. His eyes were open, but he was unresponsive to her actions. She inched closer to his face and licked his lips seductively. Her tongue traveled from his lower lip and traced the smooth contour of his neck and beyond until she reached his chest. She found his right nipple with her lips and kissed it before closing her mouth around it. She moved onto his chest where the arrow was lodged, and she licked his laceration, where blood was slowly beating from. His blood danced upon her tongue, and she smiled at him before releasing his head, which fell back to his chest. Elizabeth removed a razor and a petri dish from her pocket. The razor sliced through Jack's nipple that had just been in Elizabeth's mouth only a moment before. She collected the bright red blood that was rich with oxygen. "The blood of a lichen turned human," Elizabeth said, as Jack's blood continued to fill the petri dish. Elizabeth stood and continued to Bill. "The blood of a male lichen," Elizabeth said, as Bill's chest was sliced open, and the third petri dish was filled, and Elizabeth completed the familiar process. She stood back and smiled. A chill from the thrill coursed through her. She felt delicious in her wickedness. And she felt even more delicious knowing that by sunrise, she'd have everything she needed to locate Pandora and use its magic to end all mankind and their earth-destroying ways. "Now," Elizabeth continued, "all I need is the blood of a human turned lichen." The door to the basement flung open, and the sounds of heavy shuffling and thumping were heard. The man in black and Ginger worked together to bring down the latest trophy, Tyler. Ginger carried his feet first, as she had done with Jack and Bill, while the man in black carried him by the large, stocky wrists. Without being told, they dragged Tyler over to the far corner where the others were shackled. 2 arrows stuck out of the unconscious werewolf. Elizabeth looked at them. "He missed the first time," Ginger answered, knowing what the look Elizabeth gave her meant. "He almost made it to us, but the second mark found its place." Tyler was chained up. The large black werewolf was sliced open, and blood from the cut on his chest was collected as well. Elizabeth put forward her best Margaret Hamilton imitation with twisted satisfaction. "The last to go will see the first 3 go before her," she laughed wickedly as she looked at Karen. "Congratulations," Diller offered after the blood was collected. "You did it after hundreds of years of waiting and doubting. You got all your blood in a single day. Now, do your magic and find your Pandora's box." Dylan looked at the man in black. "Your work here is done for the night," Dylan told the man. "Go home and get everything ready for the morning. We'll be there at sunrise to start the extinction process." The man nodded once, grabbed his crossbow case, placed his weapon within it, and headed up the basement steps. He disappeared into the night. Jack moaned from where he was left. The sound of his voice startled Elizabeth. She placed the last petri dish on the workbench next to the others and rushed to him. She made sure the arrow was in place, and the head of the arrow had pierced his heart. Everything looked right. "Why is he able to moan?" Dylan asked. Before Elizabeth could answer, a loud howl from outside shook the house. Dust fell from the wooden beams of the basement, and dishes could be heard crashing and shattering to the floor above them. Elizabeth looked at Dylan. The fear and uncertainty in her eyes spoke loudly to Dylan. "Go now," Dylan commanded of Ginger. "See what that racket is, now, and bring it to me." Ginger looked horrified at the order she had been given. She knew it was better to do as told right away rather than question Dylan. She headed upstairs and out the back door. She watched and waited. "What the hell was that?" Elizabeth asked, still kneeling beside Jack. "That was hell," Jack answered. "It's coming for you." Ginger fled the house, terrified but driven by her absolute obedience that she could not refuse. She slowed her pace as she reached the woods. Dogs were barking throughout the neighborhood, and a car alarm was screaming annoyingly in the distance. Porch lights were turning on as residents were more interested in stepping out to see what horrible creature would make such a sound, rather than hiding under the beds where a monster couldn't find them. This sound was definitely from a monster. Nothing else could be capable of it. Ginger wished she were under a bed, and a zombie shouldn't fear anything. Her venture into the woods led her down the walking trail, where she came upon the answer to her question about what made the hellish sound. It was a werewolf, so it appeared in some fashion, but it was what looked to be over 12 feet tall, well over. Werewolves didn't get that massive. This werewolf, although had the typical stance, was also drenched with muscle and menace. Its face looked primate, and features like those of a gorilla could be seen behind the canine appearance. Ginger couldn't move. If her bowels still worked, they'd be the only thing moving right now. She finally found the spark of energy to turn and run, but all she was able to accomplish in her task of running was the turn. The monster, without taking more than a single step, grabbed Ginger and lifted her off the ground. Is this how Dwan felt in the grip of King Kong in the 1976 remake? Ginger wondered. Although Ginger was somewhat larger in scale, the feeling of dread at being eaten again was there. She was a stunning beauty, rotting and putrid young lady being seized by a giant Kong-like wolf. Ginger was raised higher and came face to face with the beast. Okay, Jessica Lange flirted with the animal a bit, and it worked. He fell in love with her and let her go after he was flattered. He even fell in love with her and then tore apart New York just to hold her again. "Hi," Ginger smiled as cute as she could and winked her single filmy white eye slowly to convey her message of damsel in distress, taming the savage beast. "What's a handsome fella like you doing in a place like Tracy put Ginger's arm in her vice-like jaws and bit with little effort. She pulled from her clenched teeth and Ginger screamed. The motion was repeated, this time with Ginger's head being bitten off at the neck, a clean sever. In the matter of Saturn devouring his son, Tracy bit into Ginger's right arm and devoured it. Soon Ginger's entire top half was devoured, and black intestines hung offensively from her ravaged torso. Black and brown viscous liquid dripped and splattered thickly upon the ground. Tracy continued to chew Ginger's top half, which was rancid upon her tongue. Still, she bared through the putrid flavor of the devilish redhead zombie that stung her taste buds and finally swallowed her, choking slightly on a sliver of bone. She bared the burden once again and ate the second half of Ginger as well. Saturn was full. In the basement, Elizabeth jumped up and misjudged her footing, tripping over Bill's leg before falling. She landed between his thighs. Jack was looking at her and smiling. Guess you can't use the same arrow twice. The glee Jack felt danced on his lips and sparkled in his eyes. Elizabeth righted herself. A large monstrous hand with blonde fur was sticking out of Elizabeth's chest. Blood stained the fur a crimson color. The long, leathery fingers closed around Elizabeth's heart, with black nails closing in together like a nightmarish Venus flytrap, encasing the witch's heart with the locked grip. Her eyes fell wide as Elizabeth looked down, letting the comprehension sink in like liquid intelligence into a sponge of uncertainty. Karen was a werewolf. Karen's second monstrous hand grabbed Elizabeth by the back of her neck as her hand pulled out from her back. Her shattered spine was visible through the gore and blood that Karen had inflicted on her captor. The witch's neck was squeezed so hard that Karen's fingers bit through the flesh and the anatomy underneath it. The cervical shattered, and the skin tore apart. Elizabeth's head fell to the floor with a loud thud. A single spray of blood blasted Karen in her face. Karen held Elizabeth's heart firmly in her grip. She looked at it. It wasn't a human heart. It was made of gold. Karen turned human. The change was instant. The knife fell from her body from the multiple changes causing its displacement. "Pandora's box," Karen said. Jack looked at her, stunned. From Jack's feet, Elizabeth's head stared at the golden heart. For a second, there appeared to be a glimpse of realization in her expression, and a realized truth that she had been deceived for centuries. Dylan knew she carried Pandora within her chest. He used her to get to this point. Then her eyes went blank, and her mouth fell open and flax. Her head and body began to age, withering away into a woman over 100 years old, then 200 years old, then beyond her real age. Her brittle flesh flaked and fell upon itself, taking her ashen and shattering bones with it, until she lay in a pile of gray dust, covering the clothing grabbed from a closet that day. "Congratulations," a small child's voice rang out meekly through the darkened parts of the basement. Dylan was watching the events unfold, and he was wrapped in a trap of fear and disbelief. The trap was just as strong as the nightmarish Venus flytrap that held the most powerful artifact given by the gods themselves, Pandora's box. This was not supposed to happen this way. How had the human become a werewolf? It wasn't a full moon. How did she become human again, without the bite of a human? His mind swam with questions and fear. Centuries of stalking and killing werewolf packs. He knew the rules. This was impossible, unheard of, to say the least. Something was happening that he was unsure of. Uncertainty scared him, and the darkness of it devoured his confidence. He was overcome with the feeling that he should run hard, and run fast. Dylan ran with all the speed he could muster, and his little legs carried him up the basement stairs and into the night, where there was no longer car alarms, porch lights, or barking dogs. There was only black silence. Karen, keeping a tight grip on Pandora, rummaged through Elizabeth's pockets, looking for a key to the shackles. They were all empty. She tried pulling against her chains. Jack reached over and pulled the arrow out of Bill's heart. Within seconds, Bill was awake and restraining against the chains, fighting to find clarity in what was happening. One second, he was hunting for deer. The next, he was in the basement next to human Jack and werewolf Karen. Wait, what? Oh, the confusion. How long was he out? He wondered, and he continued to try and break free from his shackles. Karen did all she could, but there was no progress. She knew Elizabeth was smart enough to get the strongest available alloy. Her hand felt warm, and the sensation took her attention away from the chains that held her and to the golden heart in her hand. Why was it warm? It flashed. A brief, almost unnoticeable spark glowed from inside Pandora. Her shackles broke free, as did Jack's and Bill's. She knew it was Pandora, but she wasn't eager to try and figure it out. She knew it would bring trouble to the world if it were used without the knowledge it took to use it. She didn't want to be responsible for that kind of trouble in the world. Pandora had to be hidden someplace where no one would ever find it, and if they did, they would not be able to get it. That was all the knowledge she had regarding Pandora. New York, present time. The sounds of traffic reached up to the 4th floor of the apartment building where a middle-aged woman sat, staring at herself in a vanity mirror. The vanity was empty of makeup or feminine accessories, except for that of a single soft hairbrush. Candles burned as the only source of light as she stared at her reflection. In a gold frame, an 8x10 charcoal sketch portrait of a man, debonair and kind-looking in his depiction, stared at her from under his top hat. A man, lying on a linoleum floor wearing a button-down shirt and denim jeans, is unmoving as blood builds around his neck. The woman turned to look at him and got up from the vanity. She quickly placed herself over the man on the floor. She knelt down and rubbed her palm on his smooth cheek. "Wake up," she whispered softly. The man stirred slightly. He opened his eyes and stared at her. "What happened?" he asked her. "You fell," she answered, "and hit your head pretty good." She helped him to his feet, steadying him as he swayed a bit from his sensation of drowsiness. The man said nothing. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Her lavender eyes sparkled in the golden flicker of the candlelight. "Thank you, Victoria," the man smiled. "I will remember none of this the moment you walk out of this apartment," Victoria finished his sentence. "Our date, my feeding, this entire evening will only be remembered as a forgotten dream." The man got up without saying another word, and he quickly left her apartment. Victoria closed the door behind him and returned to her vanity, choosing to clean the blood from her floor momentarily. But first, a strong sensation came over her, and she didn't know what it was. She felt drawn to something, to somewhere. She sat there looking at the antique gold-framed sketching of a man in a top hat. "Boris." She ran her fingers gently over his image. "My love." Victoria turned back to her reflection. Her form shifted gently and swiftly, and her features took on a different appearance. She became Elsa. The strange feeling she felt grew stronger. It was almost unbearable to try and ignore the pull she was experiencing. She had to go right away. Whatever was beckoning her was going to take her to a place where, for unknown reasons, she had to be. A place above all others she couldn't refuse to go. The name of the source calling her became prominent in her thoughts. Pandora. Why was Pandora calling her, pulling her so strongly? She quickly cleaned up the blood, packed a small bag, and headed out of her New York apartment to begin her journey to wherever it was that Pandora's box was leading her. "Go after him," Karen barked at Jack, Tyler, and Bill. Her changing from human to werewolf to human was out of control. She changed back and forth in a frenzy from fast-shaping and shifting bones and fur, claw, and saliva-dripping canines to smooth human flesh, long blonde hair, and a saliva-drenched chin from her previous werewolf state. She wiped her chin, and while still as human, Karen shouted, "Now!" Tyler didn't hesitate any longer. He ran up the stairs of the T basement and out the back door from where he had been brought through and disappeared into the woods for a hunt. A zombie and a demon child would be his prey. Bill was directly behind him. "You're unstable," Jack replied. "I won't leave you. We don't know what's causing these changes. It might be Elizabeth's magic, or some twisted and dangerous spell."